you're in agreement with me that the definition is extremely broad, then surely you would agree that the genocide that Israel stands accused of committing amounts to terrorism. Do you agree with that? Because if you do, then you're sort of understanding the point that the application's making.
Let me say this, Frank. It's not about what I agree or disagree with. I am here on this programme to ask you questions. When you have a radio programme, you invite me on and I'll maybe answer your questions at that point. What I'm asking you is, on the 7th of October, did Hamas commit a terrorist attack?
Of course, the actions on the 7th of October are caught by the very broad definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act. That's obvious.
Now, the law firm acting for Hamas in their legal application to be removed from the UK's list of terrorist organisations says the group's prescription is disproportionate and breaches the European Convention on Human Rights. Franck Magennis is a barrister at Riverway Law, acting for Hamas in this scenario, in this circumstance. Frank, good morning.
Judith, good morning. It's barrister at Garden Court Chambers, instructed by Riverway Law. It's very good to be here.
Understood, and thank you for that clarity, Frank. A prescribed organisation, then, is an organisation or a group that is illegal to join or show support for because it has been identified as being concerned in terrorism. Help us understand why there might be grounds, as far as this proceeding is concerned, that is a breach, in the context of Hamas, of the European Convention on Human Rights.
Well, I suppose there's two main things to say. Of course, it's a legal application which does rest on very extensive legal grounds. But what I'm trying to do today is to make that legible to your audience. And so the two things I think that will most help you and I to discuss what's at issue in this application are, firstly, that, of course, there is broader context, a number of propositions, legal propositions that are by this point completely uncontroversial. Some of those come to us from the International Court of Justice. Of course, South Africa and a growing number of EU states like Ireland and Spain accuse Israel of committing a genocide, and that is something that's addressed extensively in the application. But in addition to the outstanding allegation of genocide, there are a number of things that are now simply uncontroversial as a matter of international law, one of which is that as of July last year, at the latest, the ICJ has confirmed that Israel is in breach of Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is to say that it's engaged in racial segregation and apartheid against Palestinians. Apartheid, of course, is legally defined as a system of racial domination. So there's no basis for doubting that Israel is an apartheid regime that's engaged in racial domination of Palestinians, and that forms a really important part of the legal argument in the application. It's also the case, of course, under international law, that the settled position is that people who find themselves occupied, like the Palestinian people, have a right to resist. That's an uncontroversial proposition of international law. And then turning, of course, to the International Criminal Court, that court has issued arrest warrants against the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. That man's a fugitive of justice, and if he comes to this country, the United Kingdom, he will be arrested by the UK government. That's the law. And so all of that is to say that the first point is that Israel finds itself in a crisis, and it seems likely that it's going the way of apartheid South Africa, is in the process of collapsing. Okay. And if that's right, then the Secretary of State has to ask difficult questions about what does a post-apartheid Israel look like.
Fine,
and it
but
seems like
Frank, if I may, sorry, as you'll understand, restraints of time are against us on a radio programme, and I've asked why a prescribed organisation, which Hamas is, I've asked why that would be a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, and you've spoken a lot about Israel, so if I could just bring you back to my question, what are the grounds for this potentially being a breach of the human rights of Hamas?
Well, your framing is perhaps unhelpful. I will, of course, talk to you about human rights. The obvious human right engaged by the Terrorism Act 2000 is the Article 10 right to freedom of speech and expression, and that mostly relates to people in Britain who may not support Hamas at all, but may think that this application should be granted because the chilling effect on people's speech is so pervasive that people who want to talk about what a just solution, a peaceful solution to the conflict in Palestine might look like, find themselves unable to talk about it.
Okay.
And that's especially the case at the moment whenever Israel stands accused of committing genocide, right? We shouldn't become numb to how serious that allegation is.
No, and those are separate legal proceedings. And so I'm focusing today on this particular one regarding Hamas, which is, as we speak, a proscribed terrorist organisation. And the Home Secretary has chosen to prescribe this organisation under the Terrorism Act, and that is the status of Hamas right now as far as the UK is concerned. This organisation, therefore, by the judgment of several governments, commits or participates in acts of terrorism, prepares for terrorism, promotes or encourages terrorism, or is otherwise concerned in terrorism. Those are the conditions, I suppose, under which an organisation can be prescribed. Are you disputing those as part of this proceeding?
Yes, well, it's as I've said, the European Convention on Human Rights arguments do form part of the application, but the application rests on a number of different grounds, some of which have really nothing to do with that at all. And one of the grounds talks about the scheme of the Terrorism Act, which does, of course, by Section 4, create provision for an organisation like Hamas to make an application to the Secretary of State to have it removed. And one of the arguments in support of the application that I've assisted with drafting is to talk about just how broad the definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act actually is. And so what that creates is an extremely broad discretion, right? Organizations like the Ukrainian armed forces are clearly caught by the definition. It mostly revolves around things like using violence to achieve a political purpose. And if you just think about that for a moment, the armed forces of almost any nation, certainly the Israeli armed forces, are caught by that definition. So one of the arguments we're making is that, look, if you're going to create such a broad discretion, it needs to be subject to legal principles by which it can be challenged.
Fine. So your argument there is the definition is too broad, so perhaps the definition could be tightened. But hang on a second, because even tightening the definition surely would not take away the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Let's think back, shall we, to October the 7th, where Hamas killed well over 1,000 people, including 18 British nationals in that attack on the 7th of October. That was a terrorist attack committed by terrorists.
Well, lots of things happened on October 7th, and
what about that?
I agree.
Was there a terrorist attack by Hamas?
Well, hold on. If you're in agreement with me that the definition is extremely broad, then surely you would agree that the genocide that Israel stands accused of committing amounts to terrorism. Do you agree with that? Because if you do, then you're sort of understanding the point that the application is making.
Let me say this, Frank. It's not about what I agree or disagree with. I am here on this programme to ask you questions. When you have a radio programme, you invite me on and I'll maybe answer your questions at that point. What I'm asking you is, on the 7th of October, did Hamas commit a terrorist attack?
Of course, the actions on the 7th of October are caught by the very broad definition of terrorism in the Terrorism Act. That's obvious, but so too is Israel's response. And it's, I suppose, what's disturbing
about
what you're
saying there is that you're representing terrorists then in this proceeding, aren't you?
Well, it's obvious that that's the case. I mean, the organisation is a prescribed terrorist organisation, and for as long as that remains the case, then I'm representing terrorists. You seem to be suggesting that Hamas shouldn't be entitled to legal representation, and that Section 4 of the Terrorism Act, which creates a legal provision for a prescribed organisation to challenge that designation, shouldn't be entitled to legal representation. I hope you're not saying that, because that would be a really disturbing affront to the rule of law and the provision of the Terrorism Act itself, which makes clear that organisations who are going to find not just their activities, but anyone who wants to even talk about the organisation, it's the entire scheme of the Terrorism Act is to suppress speech. And if it's clear that Section 4 says such organisations do have a right to challenge the designation.
But there are differences here. I think what you're doing, Frank, if I may be so bold, is perhaps fudging this slightly, because there is a way to discuss the conditions under which the people of Gaza are living and the conditions that they are living in, and their own, I suppose, determination about how they want to live, without supporting terrorism on the way to reaching something of a solution there. And actually what it seems to me is that this has been all muddled up in this particular application when it comes to the prescription of Hamas.
Yes, that's interesting. It's not muddled at all. I think that perhaps your questions were a bit muddled because you chose to center the European Convention on Human Rights, which is, of course, a Tory attack line, right? Like make everything about the European Convention. But the fact is that that's only one aspect of the argument, and in some ways, the far more obvious.
But you're representing terrorists. I suppose I'm struggling to move past that.
Are you saying that you seem to be saying that terrorists shouldn't have legal representation? I don't understand. I've been approached to make an application under the Terrorism Act, which makes provision for such an application, and that's what I've done. I'm attempting to explain the arguments. What's crucial to understand is that the genocide is central to the application, and it's perhaps fitting that you try to take us back to October 7th,
okay.
which is perhaps understandable, but it's just, as is so common in the United Kingdom, the emphasis is shifted from something that did happen 18 months ago, and it's clear that crimes were committed on October 7th. It's not entirely clear the details of those crimes, but what is clear is that Hamas have said that they are interested in accountability processes and that they have acceded to the jurisdiction of the ICC. It's Israel that is not interested in accountability and which stands accused of genocide. And I suppose I find the emphasis of your questions quite dubious because, to be frank, which I hope you'll agree it's best for me to be, there's a real risk that by zeroing in on October 7th and acting as though history started on that date, what ends up happening is that the large number of people who were killed on that day start to get used as atrocity propaganda to justify a literal genocide. And if you're not careful about the questions that you ask,
Frank, that's why I'm using that as an example.
If you're not careful of the questions that you ask, you risk being seen to use atrocity propaganda to justify
it's not
the genocide.
Propaganda. It was a terrorist attack.
Just wait. The genocide that didn't happen 18 months ago, that is happening as we speak. Palestinians are right now being murdered because they're viewed as a demographic threat to the racial purity of an apartheid state. And I think we can agree that that's horrific. And what's necessary is difficult conversations about what to do with organisations that win elections, whether or not the British government, people in Britain, agree with those organisations. It's especially if and when we don't agree with an organisation that we need to have difficult conversations with them at the point at which they start winning elections. That's true of the South African example. It's true of the example of the north of Ireland.
Okay, let me just I've got one more question for you, Frank, and if I may, I was using an example of terrorism as a way of defining terrorism. That's what I was doing there. Can I just ask, I presume you've taken this case for free? It would be illegal, I presume, to accept money from a prescribed organisation like Hamas. Are you making money? Are you being paid for taking this case?
I am doing it pro bono, that's right. I've not been paid for this case, and nor have any of the members of the legal team, and nor have any of the experts, such as the South African expert, John Dugard, who you may remember from the South African proceedings. He submitted an expert report in support of this application. He wasn't paid for it. His expert report is about the fact that Israel's so-called right to exist is not known to international law. That's hardly a rhetorical talking point. And Professor Ravi Schleim, who you may be familiar with, of Oxford University, he too did a report. 20 experts did. None of them were paid. None of the legal team was paid. And that's because there's a sanctions regime in place, which would have been very difficult for all of us to navigate. And so we took the view that doing it pro bono was,
I suppose, yeah.
Well, that's a mistake. It's not that it's prescribed. It's the fact that there's a separate sanction regime. That's why we went.
Frank, thank you very much. Good to speak to you this morning. Franck Magennis, who is, as you heard there, taking that proceeding for free to challenge the prescription of Hamas as a terrorist organisation.